Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'm here today with part one in our Civil Rights Era video series looking at the beginnings of the Civil Rights Era. Now, the guiding question for this video is why and how was the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education a major moment in the fight for equality? So, first, let's begin by looking at a brief history of civil rights in America because it's important to always keep the history of the country in mind when looking at the advancement of rights for any group within America. Now, the fight for equal rights stretches as far back as America itself, as abolitionists began to fight to end slavery in the United States during the time of the Revolutionary War. Now, the debate over slavery would continue on and played a major role in the Civil War, as we have discussed in past units, and would culminate in President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in that proclamation, President Lincoln stated that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Now, with a Union victory in the Civil War, the United States would go on to pass three amendments in the Constitution that provided new rights to African Americans. The 13th Amendment would restate President Lincoln's proclamation in law by ending slavery, while the 14th Amendment stated that all persons born in the United States are citizens and thereby under equal protection of the Constitution. Now, finally, the 15th Amendment proclaimed that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, providing African American men the right to vote. So these were some major breakthroughs for African Americans following the Civil War. But while these amendments were very important steps in the acquisition of equal rights for African Americans, a number of factors continued to prevent this equality from occurring. Jim Crow laws were put in place in the South and would maintain segregation throughout that region of the country well beyond the Civil War. Schools, train cars, and public facilities would remain segregated so that African Americans continued to receive far worse treatment than whites. And the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson was another major blow to African Americans as well. Now, in the court's 1896 ruling, the statute of separate but equal was upheld, which allowed for continued segregation amongst Americans as long as these facilities were quote unquote equal. Now, obviously, this was almost never the case, but the Supreme Court's ruling essentially sanctioned continued inequality amongst races. Now, in the ruling, Justice Henry Billings Brown, who is pictured at the bottom of the previous slide, claimed that if the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. Now, Brown is basically arguing that the social differences between whites and non-whites was not up to the Constitution to fix. This thereby removed the courts from any responsibility of changing the lives of African Americans. So this, again, was just a major blow to the fight for equal rights for African Americans. Now, as we move forward, there was a particularly horrendous act of violence that occurred in the summer of 1955 when 14-year-old African American Emmett Till, who's pictured at the top, would visit his great uncle and cousins in the town of Money, Missouri. Now, during his visit, Till would enter Bryant's grocery store to buy a pack of gum, and Carolyn Bryant, the white woman working behind the counter pictured at the bottom, would claim that Till had wolf whistled at her, grabbed her around the waist, and made inappropriate comments toward her during his visit. Bryant would go home and tell her husband, Roy, who's pictured at the top, of her encounter with Till, And 4 days later, Roy and his half brother, J.W. Milam, would kidnap Till in the middle of the night. The two men would beat Till, gouge out one of his eyes, and then shoot and kill him before dumping his body into a nearby river. Now, Till's body would be sent back to his mother in Chicago, where she would decide to hold an open casket funeral to show those 100,000 people who attended the horrific brutality that was perpetrated upon her son. Now, Bryant and Milam would be charged for Emmett Till's murder, but the all-white male jury would, of course, acquit them of all charges. So there was absolutely no punishment handed out for this brutal act of violence. Now, this case was important because it would show America the true depth of racism in the country and would set the stage for many confrontations to come. What is perhaps most unfortunate, however, is that Carolyn Bryant would admit that she had lied about her encounter with Emmett Till some 50 years after his murder, which shows that Till's death was nothing more than one especially tragic outcome of the hatred brewing in America during this most turbulent time. Now, with this backdrop, we can now examine the beginnings of the civil rights movement in America, which was a time that would forever change the landscape of the country. Now, keep in mind that over 1 million African Americans had just served in the armed forces in World War II during the 1940s. Now, during this time, as we have talked about, the U.S. government created propaganda based upon a national identity that would proclaim the beliefs of freedom and equality, and yet the military remained segregated throughout the entire war. Now, for African American soldiers, those two ideas really clashed with one another because keeping white and black soldiers in separate companies was worlds away from true equality. So when these soldiers returned home after the war, they believed that they had made a great sacrifice for their nation and that the time to fight for true equality in America had finally arrived. Now, early in the fight for civil rights, issues would center around education equality because the schools in America had remained segregated into the 1950s. Learning environments for white students were almost always better funded and in better condition than those for non-whites. Again, a blatant violation of the whole idea of separate but equal because there was no sense of equality whatsoever. For example, a 1936 study in Florida estimated that the white school properties in the state were worth over $70 million, while the properties for African American schools in the state were worth less than $5 million, just to show how big of a discrepancy there was in education. Now, a number of cases would soon reach the courts that were arguing the unlawfulness of this fact, and a breakthrough would soon follow. Now, an early landmark in the civil rights movement came when a class action lawsuit was filed against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In this case, 13 parents filed on behalf of their 20 school children, and they claimed that the segregation of the schools in Topeka was against the law. Oliver Brown, who is the named plaintiff in the case, was a welder from Topeka, and his third-grade daughter, Linda, had to walk 6 blocks to a bus stop to ride another mile on her school bus to Monroe Elementary, an African-American school, while a white school called Sumner Elementary was only 7 blocks from the Brown home. Now, the district court in Kansas would rule in favor of the Board of Education, but the case would be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court in 1952. Now, Thurgood Marshall, who is pictured there at the top, would argue Brown's case in front of the Supreme Court. Marshall was the chief lawyer of the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he was one of the most successful civil rights lawyers in our nation's history. Now, on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, pictured at the bottom, would unanimously rule that segregation of school children was unconstitutional, overturning the long-standing ideal of separate but equal that had been created by Plessy versus Ferguson over 50 years prior. In his ruling, Justice Warren would state that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now, this case was obviously a major moment in the fight for civil rights, but the case itself was especially important because prior cases that had been ruled upon by the court had usually been based upon separate facilities that were incredibly unequal in terms of their status or the amount of money that was spent on them. However, the spending between the two schools in Topeka was relatively similar. So this allowed Marshall and the NAACP to focus their argument more upon challenging the entire practice of segregation as a whole, rather than arguing for the improvement of segregated schools. And this is what would allow the Supreme Court to strike down educational segregation as an entire practice. Now, in response to the Brown v. Board ruling, some school districts in America would integrate or bring races together relatively quickly. However, many leaders in the South promised to keep African American and white children separate in schools. And one group of Southern congressmen would announce what they called a Southern Manifesto, in which they promised not to follow the Brown ruling and instead would keep schools in their areas segregated. Now, another early moment in education equality would come on September 3rd of 1957, when a group of 9 African American students would attempt to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, Arkansas Governor Orville Fabus, pictured at the bottom, would call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these 9 students from entering the school. These students would go on to be known as the Little Rock Nine, and there was much outcry over their case, and a federal judge would soon rule that Fabus's actions were against the law, obviously based on the ruling of Brown a couple of years earlier. Now, President Dwight D. Eisenhower would send over 1,000 troops to Arkansas to protect these 9 students, and these students were finally able to attend their first day of classes on September 25th, but continued to struggle in the face of racism. As you can see at the picture of the top, one of the students is clearly being yelled at and just treated terribly by the other students at Central High School. So we will end this video once more with our guiding question: why and how was the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education a major moment in the fight for equality? In our next video, we will look at the progression of the civil rights movement, taking off from some of these early events. Until then, this has been Professor Blazek, signing off.